Right. The outline for today is being handed out, as well as one for next week. Today marks the end of my particular portion of class for a little bit, the end of this section, but by no means the end of the story. And so we'll pick it up next week. Brother Reeves will pick it up with 1 Samuel. So I was going to go back and talk a little bit more about 1 Samuel, but I realized I don't have another week if I fall behind. So today we're going to go ahead with Ruth. And no, we're not talking about Sister Scott today. Let's look at the book of Ruth. And I don't have my normal summary, but the author of this book, I always like to talk about the author, whether we know or don't know. Do we know who the author of Ruth is? No. We don't know for certain. Possibly Samuel. There's some tradition that says it might have been written by Samuel. We don't know. We can infer that it was written later on, looking back, because what's one of the clues that might let us know that? There's a couple of them. Written in the time. So the wording there kind of is looking back, right? So at the time that this was penned, that's a period that's already passed. And we also know it ends with a genealogy. And so that also is a clue that it had to be a little bit later, most likely was a little bit later, written looking backward. All right. So let's jump right in. So as we said, this is our last week. The goal is to cover the entire book today, about 10 minutes a chapter, no problem. So the nice thing about Ruth, though, is it is a story that's told. It makes it's not so much a collection of different things happening. There's kind of one purpose, one storyline that goes through. And so it makes it a little easier to cover in a lesson like this. Sometimes I've seen people write about this, that the whole point of this book is the genealogy of David. I disagree with that. I believe that it is a major aspect of this book, but God could have just presented the genealogy if that's all he wanted us to know. So these details are important. So I think saying that does the details that God's given us, it does that a disservice. There are a lot of lessons to be learned in the book of Ruth. And so if we read the whole book of Ruth and we come away with Ruth being in the genealogy of David only, that's an important part. But if that's all we come away with, then we've missed some very important lessons along the way. Yes?
He was also ancestor of Jesus.
You're right, correct. So obviously very important, because God points out this genealogy in this particular book. But I do want to just make sure that we are mindful of those other lessons that God is giving us along the way. What's one of the obvious unique aspects of this book?
I think it's just a very personal account of the relationship of a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law, and both of them being in the position of widowers.
Indeed. And we're definitely, let's talk about some of that in detail, because, well, as much detail as we can in 40 minutes. But also, just as a book bearing the name of a woman, for some, that's that presents difficulty. Should it? Not at all. Was Ruth a woman? Is this largely about Ruth? And Naomi? Absolutely. And so, thank you, because notice what I put there for just kind of summarizing chapter 1, that it's about Ruth coming into Israel. Now, there's a lot that happens in chapter 1. Why would I summarize it in that way? Well, that's what we're seeing, because even though there are different people that we're going to see, this is a story about Ruth. Now, Naomi also, we see her faithfulness, her blessings, and the like. But the driving thread of this story is Ruth, and we're going to see in chapter 1 how she comes about being into Israel. And so chapter 1 opens. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of the wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came to the country of Moab and continued there. And so, so we see right from the start, Elimelech and Naomi going into Moab, and the reason that they end up there. So they go there because of famine. And the very next verse, verse 3, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. So she's widowed now while they're in this foreign land, right? And as the story goes, Orpah and Ruth are the wives of their 2 sons, and they are widowed, right? And they have no offspring. So what would normally happen in Israel in the case of someone with no offspring being widowed? Yeah. So the near kinsman would raise up children to continue that line, not for his own sake, but for the line of the person that has actually passed away. But since both of her sons have died, there's no one to do that. There's no one that's going to continue that line. And so we see Orpah returning home while Ruth stays with Naomi. Verse number 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to journey unto the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house, and the Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead, and with me. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. So she's showing a lot of honor here, because there is no near kinsman who's going to take care of their daughters, raise up children in the name of their sons-in-law. And so she sends them back to their homes. Yes.
When the Lord dealt kindly with them, that means that it was translated as the common Old Testament word suggesting a royal commitment, which is not required, but it was taken that way.
Yeah, it was right. She was really trying to deal with them in a very positive way. What's the result of this? Well, did they say, oh, sure, let's go?
One of them, Orpah goes back and weeps. She loved her mother-in-law, but Ruth says, no, I'm staying with you.
Yeah, and initially, both of them, let's look at verse number 10. And they said unto her, surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, turn again, my daughters, what will ye go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and also bear sons, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Would ye stay for them for having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. So just notice the consideration that's going on one to another here. Naomi is doing this for their sakes. Now they're concerned about Naomi, and they're saying, no, we'll go with you. And she makes her case. She explains very well why, look, this is not really practical. And it's going to grieve me for your sakes for you to be in this situation. So go back. And Orpah goes back, but we know Ruth stays with her. Was Orpah the evil one? Did she do anything wrong by going back? No. I mean, we talk a lot about Ruth's loyalty, and it'd be easy, and we should, right? But it'd be easy to conclude that Orpah then, by contrast, is disloyal. And I believe that would be the wrong conclusion here. We see that both of them have a great concern for their mother-in-law, and one does go return and the other stays. I don't believe either one of those was someone being disloyal, but obviously God had a plan, and Ruth was part of that plan. Orpah was not part of that future plan. Yes?
You just answered my question.
Oh, all right. What was that question? Indeed, and that's obviously always what we need to keep in mind is God's movings with us. But sometimes we see people taking things upon themselves, doing things in their own name, and still God's plan comes about. But I just want to point out in this story, we see people who are genuinely concerned about one another. They did not consider her just, well, you're my mother-in-law because I'm married to your sons, and so this is what I've got to do. They had genuine concern for her. They felt like she was family, and she felt like they were family. Now, sometimes we don't have that these days, right? You know, the whole idea of filial duty seems out the window largely in our society these days. And when it comes to in-laws and the like, they get a bad rap, don't they? There's not a true relationship that's going to be formed. That's how our society looks at it. But that's not what we see here. We see a very deep bond. This is a family looking out for one another. I emphasize this because I think it would be doing it a disservice to miss that lesson here. There's stuff that we can learn from all of the details here going through it. Unfortunately, we can't look at all of those details. So Ruth stays with her, and they return to Bethlehem in verse number 19. So I think I felt like someone else had a hand up. Was there another comment? No. Okay.
I didn't, but I wanted to comment. It's interesting to me that Ruth and Orpah were Moabite women,
Yeah, so thank you for uh, commenting on that because it harkens back to earlier, verse number 4 that I did want to comment on. When he took wives of the Moabite women, uh, for some they read that as going against what God had commanded. God commanded not to take wives specifically of those Canaanites, not of the Moabites. Now there's verses in Deuteronomy that specifically talk about the Moabites entering into the congregation, but it does not forbid them to marry the Moabites. So interesting, just bit of distinction there, where when God talks about who he forbids them to marry, the Moabites aren't included in that. But when it comes to the entering into the congregation, which we see Nehemiah reference, that's a different passage, and he doesn't specifically call out and forbid them to marry. Yes.
Well, they are connected in a very odd way because Moab was the progeny of Lot through a daughter. So it's around the back door, but there was connection.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, all of them are interconnected, which is something we ought to keep in mind. When God introduces punishment to some of the people, it's for a reason. And when he forbids Israel to do something, it's for his reason. Now, man has taken in the name of God and taken that and perverted it. And we've, done a lot to separate people and keep differences as a distinction, even within the church. The church, unfortunately, and this, my opinion, is one of the most segregated places remaining. And that's a very unfortunate thing. It should not be that way. That's not a God-given thing. But that is in our recent history, and we still live with that legacy. And I'm talking about the church. I'm not talking about denominations. I'm talking about the church. And so some of that we've done in the name of God, and we've perverted some of these things. But when God has a mandate for someone to remain separate, they ought to remain separate. But there was always a reason for that God was promoting, not the reasons that we promote. Does that make sense? All right. But yeah, so, it's an interesting thing, and if you have time, look into that more, the distinction and the things that were said about Moab versus the marrying of the Canaanites, because a lot of people end up confusing some of those passages. But look at the passages that actually mention marriage and look at the ones that actually mention the Moabites and what is actually said. And it's definitely an interesting study, probably a couple of weeks study if we were to delve into it. But Naomi and Ruth go to Bethlehem. I won't say go back because Ruth did not come from there, but Naomi did, returning to Israel. So they two went until they came to Bethlehem, and it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them, and they said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said unto them, "Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" Now, those are very strong words and just very down and depressing words. What are your thoughts on that?
She's grieving. She's a loss. I mean, women, even in today's world, if you are not working and have a job and something suddenly happens to your husband, you are bereft. You really are scared.
And so there's a bit of despondency there. It's not that she's given up on God, but she does feel like God is almost punishing her, right? Has dealt bitterly with her. She's not blaming God, but rather she's saying, look, I'm in a poor state. Obviously, there's something wrong with me. Does that sound so strange in her situation? Not at all. Not at all. But we'll see how well she holds to God, and that's, again, the point that I want to make. Even in our down times, even in our times where we're going through difficulties, we're going through struggles, we can never leave the Lord. Now, we may feel down, and sometimes people will make other people feel bad about feeling down. Oh, you're a Christian. Look, we can rejoice and still feel what God made us feeling people. We can still rejoice in the name of God, but we might feel despair over the things that we're going through. Yes.
So in the case of Mary, the mother of Jesus, God told her husband what had happened, so he wouldn't put her away.
Yes. Yep, there we go. Indeed, indeed. And that's going to come into play, something like that comes into play here as we go forward. So Ruth now has a reason for her coming into the land. She comes into Bethlehem, and that's all of what we read in chapter 1 is really about moving her into that particular place. She would not have had any cause had there not been the famine, had they not gone, had they not married, had they not died. Any one of those circumstances meant Ruth would not have gone in. So we see how large a scope God's plan can take. And sometimes it may look like, well, look, I'm just discarded. I'm nothing here. But we may be playing an important part in our life or in our death as part of God's plan. And so in chapter 2, we see Boaz. And sum this one up as Boaz showing kindness to Ruth and Naomi. So as soon as they get there, what happens? Yes.
He allows them to glean the field.
Yes. Did you?
They have to find a way to make a living, basically, to feed themselves. And Naomi advises Ruth to go glean in the field.
Yes. So she goes and gleans in the fields of Boaz, and Boaz takes notice of her, right? So she's collecting what is left, right? They're collecting everything, and what is left, she gleans, and Boaz sees her and says, "Who's this?" And not only that, though, he then says, "Look, don't go into other fields." Why? Is he just, she's a good worker and he wants to keep her all to himself?
No, he's a member of the family, and he's a kindly man, and I'm sure Ruth is probably beautiful, and just stay here.
But he has a concern too, right? What's that concern? Her safety. Definitely her going hungry, so he can provide, and her staying there, he can also make sure she's safe. So not only does he say, look, don't go into these other fields because, look, I can't control what's going to happen to you there. He says he did what with the men in his field? Told them to leave her alone. Not only did he tell them to leave her alone, he told them to do something. What did he tell them to do? Yeah, drop some on purpose, right? This isn't an unheard of thing in under the law, when they harvested their fields, they were to leave the corners. For what? Benevolence, right? So he says, look, not only don't touch her, but when you're harvesting, you're going to be a little less efficient on purpose. You're going to leave something so that she's taken care of. So he's very kind, and I put that he's kind to Ruth and Naomi. Why Ruth and Naomi? This is directly about Ruth.
Because Naomi came with her mother-in-law, she was all right. She didn't have to come with her, but she did.
Right. And we see that he knows the story here. He knows who they are, what's going on, right? And so in taking care of Naomi, he's taking care of, in taking care of Ruth, rather, he's taking care of Naomi. Yes?
He's going way beyond his legal obligations to Ruth and extending so many privileges to her.
Thank you. I mean, don't you see the family dedication here that just, again, seems to be kind of lost in our society? They are all going way above and beyond, being considerate one of another. It's a very moving story. There we are. Let's see, in your outline it says Ruth finds favor with Boaz to Ruth. That's meant to be Ruth finds favor with Boaz. I just noticed that error. All right, and so in verse number 8 of chapter 2, that we went over that. Naomi advises Ruth to go with Boaz's maidens. So Boaz tells her to go out with my maidens, and now Naomi tells her, look, this is a good idea. That's the advice she gives. Verse number 19, and her mother-in-law said unto her, where hast thou gleaned today, and where wroughtest thou? Blessed be he that did take knowledge of thee. And she showed her mother-in-law with whom she had wrought, and said, the man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz. And Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, the man is near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. And Ruth the Moabitess said, he said unto me also, thou shalt keep fast by my young men until they have ended all my harvest. And Naomi said unto Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that thou go out with his maidens, that they meet thee not in any other field. So she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of barley harvest and unto the wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law. So we see the dynamic here now, and we also see a passage of time. She's doing this during the time of harvest. This is a continual thing. She's staying with Naomi, but she goes out with the maidens. That's what Naomi advised her. You stay there. You do what it is that he offered you to do. And when we go into chapter 3, we get Naomi advising Ruth again. What does she advise her? She tells...
She's actually telling her to make herself available for this man.
Yes, yeah. And, you know, depending upon your reading of this can all come across as sounding a bit questionable. But when you look at the actual story and what she tells her, she says, look, you go in and you do this privately. And you wait for him and lie at his feet. And what happened in this story? He becomes aware of her and does what?
There's a woman laying at his feet.
Indeed. Let's see. And so in verse number 6 of chapter 3, and she went down to the floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law bade her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of the corn. And she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid her down. And it came to pass at midnight that the man was afraid and turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, Who art thou? And she answered, I am Ruth, thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman. I want to point out the intention is not anything questionable. She is calling out the fact that you are a near kinsman. That has a meaning, right? She's not doing this frivolously. This is not some seduction or anything of that nature. She is going in and saying, you have a responsibility, right? And what does Boaz do?
He tells her to stay and cover herself up.
He says, I'm going to take responsibility under a condition, right? So you're going to need to wait for a moment. I can't take that responsibility now, right away. Why? There's someone who's nearer kinsman than I. And so I'm going to go and take care of that matter. But he makes it very clear that he intends to take responsibility for her. So this isn't anything questionable. This is all according to their law. And it's also, we see there's already been great affection extended here. And so again, depending upon how we look, especially with the eyes of our society versus the eyes of the scripture and spiritual, it can look one way or another. But Boaz does accept responsibility. And chapter 4 is all about the marriage of Ruth and, well, not all about, but mostly about the marriage of Ruth and Boaz. And so the first thing Boaz does is he talks to the near kinsman. What does the near kinsman say? Yes.
She says, I like the feel of the kinsman. But then Boaz is very crafty in saying, but you also have to take this widow as wife.
Indeed. Indeed. Yes.
So he defers because he doesn't want full package.
Yep. Doesn't want to take responsibility for everything. Definitely wants the land, but not all the responsibility that goes with it. But the land was going to be an inheritance, right, to the lineage. So you can't have one without the other. That's something our society doesn't like. We want to take the things we want and leave the responsibility and the accountability, right? Boaz comes across as a pretty honorable person here, doesn't he? He's not looking, at no point do we see him looking to skirt responsibility for anything. So he does the right thing, he approaches them, he does it in the sight of witnesses, so that there is no question about it. And I'm skipping ones. So there's no question about what's been decided, what's been discussed, and whether anything was proper. And you get a little insight there into the contract with the removing of the shoe. I always find that funny because that's just, then what do? Hobble along on your way? Everyone knows you've made a deal. It's just, everyone has different, when you look at things from different cultures, they can look very odd and unusual to you. And when I read this, it's just one of those things that, that's no signing, no, digital signature. I'm just going to give you my shoe. I think I'd make sure I wear shoes I don't want the day I have to make a deal. But it's just one of those things that just stands out, yes.
But I think this whole deal beyond that too is the contract nature of it, right? How much of a business decision this was, even though it's involving humans and lives and families' future, it's very much just this business decision and the rules you see them go through, where Boaz is like sticking with those rules.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There's so much I'd love to say about this, and I have to say about this, but we can't. But that one is something I don't want to let go by. Our view of marriage is very different today than it was in the Bible. Is marriage any different today than it was in the Bible? What was that?
Well, I just would say marriages are not arranged by the parents. They go out on their own and find their own mate themselves.
Largely in our country, I do know someone whose marriage was arranged by their parents. And again, that sounds very odd to us. Is that non-scriptural today? Are they wrong for doing that today? Nothing's changed there. Our culture, our society has changed, but nothing's changed there. And so when we see something like that, we might think, well, that's very strange. My daughter is on tape when she was 3 saying I could pick her husband. So, but she didn't give me her shoes. So I guess maybe it's not, maybe it's not legally binding. But you know, our view of marriage today is very different. But first and foremost, there is a commitment, so that contract-like nature is something that we ought to take seriously, right? And so however it might come about, there's a responsibility, there's an accountability. Husbands are told to love their wives, wives are told to love their husbands, and you may have ups and downs and difficulties along the way, but that contract nature, that commitment nature, if you will, is always there. And so it's something that we definitely need to take note of. We're just about out of time, but we're also just about at the end. Boaz marries Naomi, and with all of this, how succinct that aspect of it is also a bit striking. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife, and when he went in unto her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. There's a whole story there, you know. If it were a Hallmark movie, I'd want the wedding and all of the, you know, the nice ending, but this was all just summarized in one verse. But everything was leading up to that. And from there, we see Naomi talked about. How is she talked about? What is said about her? She's got a son. And what else? Remember how she was saying God's
She has hope and security.
hope, you know, it's a very positive outlook, right? Remember the bitterness before? God dealt bitter. No, you're blessed. You're blessed. Now, you didn't know it at the time, but you're blessed to be part of this story, to be part of this lineage, to be part of God's plan. And so sometimes we may be going through some things and we don't know, but we may be part of a grander plan. We may be blessed and we don't even know it. We may not feel like it. That's the reason we have to endure. That's the reason we have to go on. Before the bell rings, the last part of this is the genealogy of David. And we see Boaz begat Obed, and that being directly part of the genealogy of David. And why is it important to note even the genealogy of David? He's a king, great. What else? He's also in the line of Jesus. So, you know, this whole story, again, there's just so much there. And I'd love to emphasize this, the familial nature that's in here. Whether somebody is blood related, or not, the fact of how they treat one another is a model that, we would do well to read this story and remember it in our own relating to one another, not just our blood family, but our family here, one another. Be considerate, concerned for one another, take care of one another. Did everyone get a copy of Samuel? If you didn't, if you came in later, try to pick up a copy of that. Again, Brother Reeves will pick up next week with 1 Samuel, and we'll continue on with the story. I thank you all for your attention, not only this week, but every week.